So when you're in a conflict with a narcissist, it could be tempting to either throw in the towel or play their game back. Truth is, neither of these are likely to yield your desired outcome. So today, I'm going to share some tips on how to take the high road and get what you want. But first, let me just say this. I am not a licensed therapist. So when I use the term narcissist, I want to be clear that I am not referring to a medical or a psychological diagnosis, but I'm rather using this term as a layman might, to refer to somebody who comes across as self-absorbed, unable or unwilling to take others' perspectives, or someone who just kind of sees themselves in this unalterably positive light and is resistant to feedback. So, with that in mind, here are 3 ways to get what you want and take the high road. First, this sounds really easy, but it's really hard to do. And it's be a really good listener. Now, I have a bunch of videos on this channel all about how to listen well. So if you haven't watched them, you might go to them. In fact, if you have not subscribed to my channel, please be sure to do so. But listening, this is the key skill for great negotiators and particularly for narcissists, because active listeners are always reflecting what they hear back to the person who's speaking. And narcissists really love to hear their own words reflected back to them. Second is really build a golden bridge for that other side. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you are in a conflict, particularly with someone who is self-absorbed, who is feedback resistant, and who thinks they're really great, it is going to be incredibly hard to persuade them that you're right and they're wrong. It's already hard to persuade people who are reasonable that you're right and they're wrong. Therefore, the goal here is to build them a pathway that makes it really easy for them to say yes. So when we say a golden bridge, it's basically this path that can bring them to your side, but that feels like a complete win to them. And so what that means is framing choices for them that make them look good, that make them look like they're getting everything in this. So let me share with you a story. Some years ago, I was working with someone who I would say was probably a narcissist, but again, I'm not an expert. I wouldn't necessarily say that that was a diagnosis. But what I do know is that this is a colleague who basically could never say yes to an idea that was not their own. And the challenge is that this person rarely had good ideas. But over time, I developed a strategy that worked pretty well. And it would look like this. In a given meeting, I would throw out an idea that I thought was a pretty good idea. When I say good idea, I thought that it was an idea that would meet my interests well and also their interests very well. And an idea that I thought would actually create some value. And I almost always, for sure, would know that the response would be no for the following reasons. And this person would list a whole bunch of reasons why it wasn't a good idea and why their idea was a good idea. And I would do some active listening, write my point number 1, and thank them so much and kind of walk away. I would say something like, let me take that under counsel. And then I'd wait some time and I would come back and I would say, thanks for that last meeting. There were a bunch of things we talked about. And one of them I would put forward was the idea that I had put out. But I would say something like, one of the things we talked about was this, and I remember you brought it up. And if the idea genuinely was good, this person would suddenly say, that is such a good idea. I'm so glad I thought about that. And I would be like, I'm glad as well. I wish I would have just said yes immediately. Thank you for that really good idea. Now, you might say, gosh, this feels a little bit icky. But I think the truth of the matter is, at least from my perspective, like one of my interests was not necessarily to have the idea credited as mine. It was to get an outcome that my interests well and their interests also well. And if that meant letting them get the credit, that was fine to me, right? That was the golden bridge. So if I can do that, right, I usually personally don't care about whether an idea is mine or not. What I care about is it a good one? Is it creative? Will it meet our interests? Will it bridge the difference? Last thing I want to say here, and I think this is easier said than done, but when we're in a negotiation with someone who is self-absorbed, someone who can be narcissistic, remember, it's about them, not about you. That is to say, there is a way when we find ourselves in a negotiation with someone who is really resistant to feedback, who might be critical of you, who feels like every single thing going wrong is because somebody else did it or because Mercury was in retrograde. And that can rattle you in a conflict. That can rattle you in a negotiation. So the more you can be centered, the more you can realize, hey, here's what I bring to the table. Here's who I am. Part of this conflict really isn't me, it's them, and that can be really helpful. You know, one of my life heroes is Dan Rather. Some of you may recognize the name, others you may not, but he was the anchor of the CBS Evening News for 24 years, and in fact worked at CBS News for 44 years. And so if you're working at a national news network for 44 years, you are interviewing hundreds of narcissists because, frankly, many political leaders tend to have a narcissistic tendency. And one of Dan Rather's kind of famous internal coaching lines to himself was this. He would say, never let the bastards scare you. And I just really love this because in those moments when you feel like you're being bullied, when you feel like there's a self-absorbed person that's making you feel really small, to just think, I know who I am, I know what my interests are, I know what's legitimate, and I'm not going to be bullied here, I'm not going to be scared here. Okay, so let's just recap these important steps. First, really lean into your active listening skills. Active listening, someone who's self-absorbed, is incredibly powerful. It makes them feel seen and heard and more secure. And that active listening can be the tactic that gets them to move away from self-absorption to really working with you. Second, build the other side a golden bridge. Frame all of the questions in ways that make it an easy yes for them, whether that's crediting them with the idea, framing it as a win for them, making it seem like a concession from you and not from them. Third, be grounded. Their narcissism, their self-absorption is not about you. Remember Dan Rather's phrase, never let the bastards scare you. So I'm really curious to hear your strategies for how you deal with self-absorbed people when you're in conflict. So please put them in the comments. Also, before you leave here, please subscribe to my channel. Please like this video and ring the bell so you never miss any new content. And watch this next video, which is why silence is powerful when negotiating a deal. Okay, don't be silent, keep watching. Click, click.